A really crucial element to understand about President Trump's negotiation styles and strategies, and I've studied him, as I said, my book really analyzed, well over 100 Trump negotiations over the past 40 or 50 years, is he looks at the world in black and white. There's not a lot of gray in between. And he looks at President Putin as a friend.
Let's start with the basics. What are the golden rules of negotiating?
There are 5 golden rules to negotiating. The first is information is power, so get it. You need to set your goals. You need to figure out what you want to accomplish, and you need to step into the other side's shoes. What do they want to accomplish? What are their interests? What are their needs? And the idea in a negotiation, of course, is to find the sweet spot and the mutual interests where those goals overlap. A second golden rule of negotiation, maximize your leverage. 2 elements of leverage. First is, how much do you need a deal relative to how much the other side needs a deal? The more desperate you are, the weaker your leverage. The more desperate they are, the stronger your leverage. And the second element is, what are you going to do if you don't do a deal with the other side? What is your plan B? Plan A being any kind of a deal, maybe many different variations of a deal, A1, A2, A3. Plan B is what are you going to do if you don't do a deal? The stronger, the better your plan B, the stronger your leverage. The other part of the plan B is not only what is your plan B, what is their plan B? Because you may have a really good plan B, but if they have an even better plan B, you may have relatively weak leverage. The third golden rule of negotiation, employ fair objective criteria. How do you evaluate in any negotiation what's fair or reasonable or unfair or unreasonable? What kind of norms or standards or benchmarks might exist? Is there some precedent for this particular deal point? Fourth golden rule, design and offer concession strategy. When do you make your moves? How far do you move each time? Should you make a first move or not? These are very strategic and tactical decisions that need to be made in almost every negotiation. And then the fifth golden rule, final golden rule, control the agenda. When do you meet? How do you meet? Do you meet on a neutral site? Who actually is going to be sitting at the table? Those are basically the building blocks of strategic negotiation based on the experts' proven research.
And now, when you mention the term negotiation, I think people can think of different things. You can think of making business deals, diplomatic negotiations like we're discussing here, and then even, more extreme scenarios like hostage negotiations and things. Do these 5 golden rules apply to all of those across the board?
They absolutely apply across the board, but the implementation of them in different contexts requires different focus and different emphasis on those different golden rules. So in a very hostile diplomatic negotiation, leverage is going to have an outsized impact, and it's going to have a much greater ability to drive the party's behavior. In a business deal, between 2 partners or between 2 family members, hopefully leverage is not going to be the driving force. Instead, it's going to be standards, norms. What have we done before in terms of resolving some of our conflicts? And of course, in family negotiations, it's a whole different world, but these 5 golden rules still apply. This is really what the research supports in this environment. A couple of factors that should define how aggressively you implement those 5 golden rules. Probably the most important one is whether or not you anticipate and want a future relationship with the other side. So for instance, in negotiations between the previous U.S. administration, the Biden administration, and Ukraine, we were allies. We had aligned interests, and both parties wanted a future relationship with the other side. It remains to be seen in the new negotiations between President Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky, whether or not both sides really anticipate and want that same type of allied future relationship. Certainly, the dynamics of that very contentious and antagonistic White House meeting that occurred in the not too distant past would suggest that the relationship between the parties is far different obviously, than it was previously. That's going to define how aggressively you engage in that negotiation.
Do you feel confident enough to make any predictions about what might happen? Can you see that any sort of path has already been set, or do you think that everything is still completely on the table?
I think the path has been largely set, at least for the next couple of weeks, if not for the next couple of months. And it goes back to the party's goals and their leverage. President Putin and Russia's goals have always been to increase their sphere of influence, to be viewed as a world superpower, and to, in effect, reintegrate Ukraine into Russia as a world power. So that is his goal. That has been his goal. He's been very clear about that goal for years, literally. His alternative to doing a deal right now, which is armed conflict, is actually helping him accomplish that goal. So as long as he is enjoying what he perceives to be military success on the ground, we're not going to have any significant progress toward a cessation of hostilities and peace. Because there's no reason for him. His plan B is better than his plan A. Plan A being any type of peace deal, but as long as he is advancing on the battlefield and the U.S. is exercising leverage against Ukraine, but not Russia, he's winning. And if he's winning, why would he ever do a deal that gives him less than what he's able to accomplish on the field? Now, of course, he's losing thousands of Russian lives, but again, how is that evaluated relative to his goal? I don't think he really cares that much about those Russian deaths. In fact, some would argue that his control in Russia over the economy, over the people, over the political system is actually enhanced because Russia is in a wartime footing and any type of dissent can be crushed by Putin and in line with his dictatorial ambitions around the world.
So do you see that, is there any way that the White House in America or even Ukraine could change that calculus, or do you think that it's pretty much how it's going to go?
That calculus absolutely can be changed, but it would require a substantial increase in military and economic support from the United States to Ukraine, because you've got to change the facts on the ground. You've got to change the military. You've got to stop Russia, and you've got Russia to understand that pursuing a military solution is worse for Russia than any type of peace deal. But so far, we haven't seen the political will in the United States for that from the Republican Party and from the president. And so unless and until President Trump utilizes some of his leverage with Russia, economic leverage on the sanctions front, and does that in a very aggressive way, I don't see there being any long-term cessation of hostilities or peace deal. Hopefully, President Zelensky will be able to increase and strengthen his plan B, which is Europe coming to the rescue, because that could also change the facts on the ground. But my understanding of Europe's ability and capability of helping is in the short term relatively limited.
You mentioned the now infamous Oval Office showdown there, and there's been various events over the last few weeks which could be politely described as undiplomatic between Ukraine and the US. Do you see that as Trump, who obviously has grown up and worked in more of a business environment for most of his life, is that like a symptom of him trying to impose the sort of etiquette of business negotiations into the diplomatic world?
I think that that's a very insightful point. Keep in mind that Donald Trump has been negotiating largely in the same way with similar tactics, similar strategies for 50 plus years. And despite the fact that he was president for 4 years, he still uses the same tactics and strategies that he used in business. And in some contexts, they worked in business, and in some contexts, they miserably failed. And so it's not so simple as to say he's just trying to use business strategies in a political environment, and he is, but that he has failed to learn, in effect, how to negotiate differently in an environment where there are multiple parties, multiple interests, very complex diplomatic engagement, and his real sweet spot in negotiations, to the extent that it worked in the past, were one-shot deals where there were one or two issues on the table, and he didn't have a future relationship. It's a whole different environment in which he's negotiating now. He does understand leverage, which has an outsized impact in both negotiations, but he really did not effectively negotiate for 4 years as president in his first term. And I would suggest that he has started out his second term, again, using the same tactics that I analyzed in my book, The Real Trump Deal, an eye-opening look at how he really negotiates. He's using the same tactics that miserably failed in his first term, and now they're having the same impact at the beginning of his second term.
Another person in his administration who's made quite a lot of headlines lately is Steve Witkoff, obviously a real estate mogul with very little diplomatic experience. In his interview with Tucker Carlson last week, he said he told the story about how Putin presented him with a portrait of Donald Trump and told him a story about how Putin prayed for Trump when he was shot in the ear in his failed assassination attempt last year. And this seemed to move Witkoff quite deeply. Is there a technical name for that sort of negotiation technique that Putin is employing?
Well, I think what Putin is doing is relatively transparent, as the message to Witkoff really was a message through Witkoff to President Trump. And the relationship between President Putin and President Trump has baffled many experts over a number of years. But this is, I think, a reflection of it, and how Putin is very skillfully playing to President Trump's ego in that regard. President Trump, as many people have recognized, has a pretty massive ego. And President Putin has a pretty massive ego too, but understands that the way to get and keep on President Trump's good side is really to play to President Trump and play to what President Trump perceives to be his own innate power. And I think that by really sharing that with Steve Witkoff in that regard, knowing that that would immediately get back to President Trump, it's telling President Trump, hey, I really care about your interests, your health, your needs. Whether or not it's true, that's a completely different question. I would suggest, knowing President Putin's background coming out of the intelligence services, that it was a very manipulative ploy to play to Trump's ego in that regard.
So we just discussed there about how Trump and Witkoff and the rest of the administration maybe aren't going about this in the best way diplomatically. But is it fair to say that Putin and Sergei Lavrov and other Russian officials have been doing this for decades? So do you consider them quite seasoned and pretty learned in their negotiating strategies?
I think that President Putin and Sergei Lavrov, they understand the game. It's not the fact that they've been doing it for so long, but they've been skillful at doing it in their world. If President Trump had been someone who came to the White House in his first term and said, you know what, this is a different environment. Political, governmental, diplomatic negotiations are extraordinarily different than the real estate negotiations in which he had engaged, and he sought to understand them. He used the State Department experts in negotiation to fully appreciate some of the nuances, the subtleties in the negotiation, and had schooled himself in doing it in a different way. I think that, certainly potentially, and some presidents have done this, he could potentially have been a far more effective negotiator in his first term and, of course, now in his second term as well. So it's not just the length of time they've been doing it, but the expertise that they have developed in doing it in that particular regard.
Trump has obviously leverage over Ukraine. He has, in theory, a lot of leverage over Russia. He just doesn't seem to be taking advantage of that at the moment. So do you think he's just using leverage over Ukraine as the quickest route to ending the war?
A really crucial element to understand about President Trump's negotiation styles and strategies, and I've studied him, as I said, my book really analyzed, well over 100 Trump negotiations over the past 40 or 50 years, is he looks at the world in black and white. There's not a lot of gray in between. And he looks at President Putin as a friend. Why does he look at President Putin and Russia as a friend? I personally think it goes back to 2015, 2016, when an independent bipartisan investigation by the US Congress found that Russia actually helped Trump get elected president. And so Trump views Putin as, in effect, as someone who is aligned with his personal interests, not the US's maybe strategic interests, but President Trump's personal interests. And that's why, even though Trump does have, and the US has significant leverage over Russia with regard to economic leverage, with regard to the severity and scope of the sanctions, he, at least at this point, does not appear willing to utilize that leverage to try to get Putin to make concessions. It remains to be seen whether or not that personal dynamic and that personal loyalty that he feels from Putin and to Putin will overcome his goal of trying to get peace. We'll see. He might be willing to use it, but you're absolutely right. To date, we have not seen him use the leverage that the U.S. has over Russia.
And Ukraine and President Zelensky as basically the weakest player in these negotiations. How should he approach negotiations with the U.S.?
Well, I think it's interesting because you take a look at that disastrous Oval Office meeting and you say, well, President Zelensky really messed up as a result of how J.D. Vance and President Trump took after him in that extraordinary session that was obviously filmed by the news media. And yet, if you actually analyze what President Zelensky was doing, is he was simply articulating his interests in having a secure peace from Russia. And I think that he felt blindsided by it. Now, he obviously learned from what happened there, which is you cannot really negotiate with Donald Trump in the sort of normal diplomatic way that he negotiated, for instance, with the Biden administration or with other parties, because Trump is a very unique individual in terms of how he needs to have his ego, in effect, stroked and built up before he can really even listen and hear some of the substantive elements of the negotiation. You take a look at what President Macron of France and what Keir Starmer of Britain did when they met with Trump, and they spent a fair amount of time basically buttering up Trump. And that is something that a wartime leader like President Zelensky perhaps, not perhaps, did not do in that Oval Office meeting. That gave J.D. Vance an opening to try to drive a rift and accomplish his goals, which was to be a player in this negotiation and in effect blow up that meeting. Now, you've seen since that Oval Office meeting, I think President Zelensky has adopted the same approach that France and Britain have in terms of recognizing, being very thankful to President Trump and the United States, but more importantly, to President Trump for the intelligence sharing, the military support, and you've seen the spigot turned back on to a certain extent as a result of that change in strategy.
Thanks to our 16,000 members, we now have a sustainable source of funding. But with uncertain times ahead, we're counting on you to help us keep the stories coming. Thanks again for watching. If you'd like to see more great interviews like that, you can sign up to become a subscriber of the Kyiv Independent at kyivindependent.com/membership.